Well, welcome everybody on the call today. I'm Nathan Waltham from James Cook University. So I'm the lead for the Australasian Coastal Restoration Network in conjunction with Megan Saunders, who's from CSIRO. So both Megan and I have been working in the background to develop a seminar series for this year. So this is in addition to the symposium that we have and the newsletter and all the great work that gets done in behind the scenes. We've decided through lots of popular interest to set up a seminar series for this year. So today's the first one, and super excited to have James Brazill-Boast from New South Wales DQ, who is the team leader for restoration science, and is going to walk us through and unpack what they're proposing in New South Wales in terms of a landscape restoration framework. And James tells us early days, lots of ideas and a great vision. So today's an opportunity to hear about that and then also start the conversation and help with our colleagues in New South Wales and James's team as well. As I mentioned, we've got almost every month now locked in presenters covering broad-scale coastal marine restoration topics, and they will slowly unfold in the next month or so as we start to lock in our presenters and dates. So really excited to have you and have your time today. I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to James. So once again, thanks everybody for your time today, and particularly thanks, James, and I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, James.
No worries. Thanks very much, Nathan. You can hear me and see the first slide. All right, I assume. Thanks again, Nathan. Thanks everyone for having me. I'm here. My name's James Brazill-Boast. I'm with the Restoration Science team within New South Wales DQ. I share that role with Ian Oliver, that team, and my sort of current responsibilities around delivering this landscape restoration framework, which I'm going to talk about today. Before we kick off, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming from Aboriginal land, as are we all. I'm in Darug and Guringai country here in Hornsby. I just want to acknowledge ongoing custodianship of First Nations people across Australia and across New South Wales for tens of thousands of years, and their connection to land and country and waters, particularly for this audience. And I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present and future, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the call today. So, sorry, before I move on, I guess a general preface for this talk is that the agency is developing a lot of this work. We're developing this framework. Nothing that I talk about today is really policy at the moment. It's kind of our general thinking and trying to, I guess, expose some of that thinking to as broader audience as possible. And particularly this audience, I think, for reasons I probably don't have to go into for this audience, there's a risk of biasing a lot of this work towards the terrestrial realm. And so I'm really interested in hearing from this group on initial responses to this work and whether you can see any gaps in the aquatic and coastal domain. And so really, sharing some of our thinking and some of the how we're thinking to respond to what's already out there in the public domain. But yeah, I guess just acknowledging that it's not none of this is really policy yet. We're sort of developing it over the next 12 months or so. So probably not news to this group in terms of the problem we face with ecosystem degradation, specifically in New South Wales. So these data are from our New South Wales Biodiversity Outlook report released in 2024. And again, apologies, they are, is quite terrestrial focused, but it gives a bit of a flavour, I think. So generally our capacity to support biodiversity is down, connectivity and resilience down, in terms of threatened species and extinction risk keeps going up, based on things like IUCN Red List assessment and assessments of risk to ecosystems and species assessed by our scientific committee. we're often at or past tipping points for collapse. And noting that, this map probably doesn't do justice to a lot of the sort of coastal, aquatic, and wetland systems that people on this webinar might work in, particularly the scale of that map. And I guess that map at that scale tells a story about specifically things like the sheep wheat belt in New South Wales being a real focus, but obviously we recognise there are a lot of, at smaller scales, a lot of ecosystems that require a lot of attention. So what's the solution? Well, something we're kind of thinking about at the moment and really recognizing is that historically our approach, and I think with a focus on our agency as well, but more broadly to addressing sort of biodiversity, is a sort of conservation approach. We historically, and this is generalizing, we tend to look at where is the best of what's left, where are the high condition remnants, and where do we have to protect those through, in particular, permanent protection, public reserves, private land conservation, with less of a focus on what can we do in those degraded places. In many contexts, ecosystem restoration is perceived as expensive and risky. So when we do kind of traditional cost efficiency prioritizations, the protection of high condition remnants floats to the top above restoring low condition sites, just because of the way things like benefit and cost and risk are built into those algorithms. So we really need a bit of a paradigm shift, not away from conservation and protection, but towards and including restoration to complement protection if we ever want to achieve, turn these systems around and have a nature positive outcomes and achieve the viability of some of these ecosystems and bring services back. And the word landscape, even in this, we've had discussions with people that work in coastal and marine and aquatic domains, and it suggests obviously a terrestrial bias. But as I'll talk about, the scope of this work from the New South Wales Government's perspective is all domains, including the marine domain as well. So, as again, you probably all know, we're sort of in a more of an authorising environment at the moment for ecosystem restoration. People are probably well versed in the targets under the Global Biodiversity Framework. For example, Target 2 talks about restoring 30% of degraded ecosystems by 2030. Our plan for nature, published in 2024, makes high-level commitments around putting nature on a path to recovery and about landscape restoration. So this is really the only thing at the moment in terms of what I'm going to talk about today that is in the public domain. So the government published this document in 2024 as a response to the Henry Review of the Biodiversity Conservation Act. And it talks in sort of high-level terms about shifting towards a restoration approach, the need for restoration. It commits the government to develop a nature strategy as a statutory document that will set explicit targets for ecosystems. And it acknowledges that ecosystem restoration is going to be required at scale and across tenures and across land uses. And that's particularly the scale required, if that's paired with ambitious targets, is likely to be relatively unprecedented for, at least in New South Wales, but I would say across Australia at least. So I won't go on about this too much. Everyone in this room is probably very aware of this kind of approach and these kind of graphics about what is restoration. We'll have a requirement in New South Wales under both the legislation and the policies and regulations and frameworks that flow from that to define restoration in different ways. So there will likely be what I'd call a dictionary definition in the legislation, which will be very much, just that, quite a dictionary definition of what we see restoration as being. But I think to support that and complement that, there will need to be, I guess, sort of some policy and communication definitions. And kind of by that, I mean, how are we actually going to, what are we going to call restoration on the ground and across with reference to various policies and programs. And from a landscape restoration framework perspective, particularly given we see the priorities for restoration in multi-use and agricultural landscapes, we are very keen to make that definition as broad as possible, essentially encompassing any activity that leads to a biodiversity value being in a better state than it was yesterday. And so that allows for, a lot of flexibility in what kind of activities are considered restoration and are considered contributing to our targets. And in an operational sense as well, if the government is going to invest in something called restoration, we will need quite specific definitions around things like incentive programs in terms of where does it count and when does it not count as restoration. So the way we have been thinking about developing this framework is really around, I guess, in the first instance, and there is, admittedly probably a terrestrial bias around this thinking, and I'd be interested to hear from this group on whether they think it applies as much. But there are currently a lot of barriers to successfully scaling up effective restoration. And these come from sort of linked to the fact that as a generalization, we haven't done a massive amount of restoration in New South Wales. And so the sector is underdeveloped in terms of the number of people who are sufficiently trained in ecological restoration, infrastructure, things like seed availability, things like equipment, the evidence base, just from the fact that we haven't done a lot, there is research, but there are a lot of ecosystems for which we have very little evidence, particularly in terms of long-term data sets where implementing activity ABC gets us outcome XYZ, particularly over long time frames. We know we have legislation and regulation, which is often inhibiting, and I think there will be people listening to this who have experience of that, particularly in the coastal realm, and doing restoration and the kinds of mechanisms that prevent that or make it very expensive and cumbersome. And despite a lot of rhetoric around private finance and markets, I think as of right now, there is limited demand and limited private capital, even though I think there's a broad optimism and expectation that will flow, but there's some uncertainty around that and in terms of meeting the resourcing challenge. But on the flip side, there's some real opportunities. We see, and again, with thinking from our perspective and our expertise and the history of our team at the moment in terms of things like grassy woodlands in the sheep wheat belt in New South Wales, but I think this applies generally across marine and coastal and wetland systems. There's a real potential for economic uplift. There's through things like TFND and nascent nature markets. There are opportunities to increase supply chain resilience and increase ecosystem services and start valuing those services. As I've already mentioned, there's nature markets emerging that we can look at with, I think, cautious optimism. It is going to require government leadership in this space, and I think that's kind of what we're hoping to achieve as the sort of starting point of that with the nature strategy and the landscape restoration framework is to kind of say, well, this is what we want to achieve, and the New South Wales government is very dedicated is going to commit to trying to achieve these things. And so what does that look like, and what are the things? I think one of the really key questions for us is what are the things that only government can do, or the most efficient things that government can do to complement everything else that's going on out there already. And we do have, and I'm sure people listening now are thinking of lots of examples. We do have evidence of success when the conditions are right. We have lots of examples of where there's sufficient resources and time and knowledge and expertise and willing land managers dedicated to restoration. There's some amazing examples of success that we can build on and learn from. And some examples of that, and this comes from a lot of the work, particularly Paul Gibson-Roy in my team, who has a background in grassy system restoration, particularly in that really highly degraded end of the landscape, and bringing that back. There's some really high quality examples of success there, as I'm sure there are in coastal systems, which if I had a coastal person in my team, I would have photos of those. Um, One of the really key things as well that we are going to ensure is front and center in this framework, and front and center and thinking is the fact that, people are key to this. And there are obvious sort of differences in the marine and coastal context, but definitely in the central west of New South Wales and in the kind of terrestrial landscapes that we know require restoration. This is all essentially private land, and much of it is overlaps with land that's high value for agriculture. And so people are going to be fundamental to creating an enabling environment to actually get restoration happening at scale. There are people, they're stewards of the land. I think we can no longer just divide the landscape up into, we'll have some national parks over there and we'll have farming over there, and never the twain shall meet. A big focus for us is going to be to find those win-win scenarios where a primary producer can be improving the biodiversity value and the functionality of their land, and at the same time have more money in their pocket than they did before. I think that's the sort of $60 million challenge we're trying to achieve. And while noting there are going to be trade-offs there that we need to strategically plan around, we need to, when we are doing that planning and then we're working out what has to happen where and how, we need to have those regional livelihoods and food and fiber security as strategic objectives just as much as biodiversity objectives. And like I said, those win-win solutions are possible. But this, as it started with, a big part of the planning for this, and the big part of what we're thinking is a priority will be going into communities and saying, hey, you guys are the stewards of this land and you've been managing it for a long time. We have these objectives around biodiversity, and we hopefully have resources. And so you tell us the best way to deploy them and the most efficient way to deploy them to get the outcomes we're after and the outcomes you're after. And that's easy. That's an easy thing to say, and it's not an easy thing to do, but that's, at least we're going to make that front and center of this framework as a key way to achieve those outcomes. So again, this is not policy. This is just a bit of a snapshot of some early thinking for how we might structure up a landscape restoration framework to address essentially what are the barriers now to scaling up restoration in New South Wales, and a way just to sort of group, I guess, the problems and the solutions really. And so, as I just mentioned, like a fundamental will be that community engagement and understanding what are the socioeconomic drivers of landholder decision making when it comes to engage with or not, biodiversity outcomes and restoration. And that involves, what is there out there in the marketplace at the moment, things like carbon, there's offsetting, there's various incentive and extension programs. How do we leverage all of that to and understand what is motivating people to make decisions? What we're calling a decision support framework. So kind of bringing together all of the evidence base for restoration outcomes, what are the options for a given proponent in terms of what biodiversity outcomes can be expected for a given investment at a given starting state of biodiversity, and trying to bring that together in a place that provides a resource for restoration practitioners and proponents, but also a resource for government at the back end of that with all the data on what's happening where, what are the predicted outcomes of that, and then what does that mean for the landscape at large and the ability for us, or the likely ability for us to meet ecosystem targets over the long term, and therefore what kind of policy levers and mechanisms do we need to shift if we're not on track to meet those targets. So that's the form that'll take is still very much up in the air. There are a lot of products out there at the moment. The things like the Commonwealth Government have deployed, like Planner, other carbon-focused tools, and uh, other products from the Commonwealth like EMSA and the merit system for reporting on outcomes. There's a lot of aspects of all those things that we think we need to have, and so, but we definitely don't want to reinvent the wheel. So I guess thinking about what's the gap in that space? Is there a coordination role for government to bring those things together? But yeah, thinking about that at the moment. Sector capacity building. So I touched on this before as like a really key barrier. I think there's a real, and yeah, I think there probably are sort of some key differences with coastal and marine systems here, but definitely in the terrestrial space, there is issues with, big issues with things like seed supply. How do we, if we're going to be restoring, thousands and millions of hectares and scaling that up from what we're doing now, when we struggle, I think now to get sufficient supply of quantity and quality in respect to a genetic and resilience, as just two examples, perspective. How are we going to supply that seed? What does that look like? How are we going to do workforce planning to have sufficient people on the ground planning and delivering restoration that is quality? All of these things, I think that'll kind of lift all boats. So what are the things that the government can invest in to essentially sort of create this enabling environment so that when there are proponents with money to do restoration and when there are resources, that it'll be delivered effectively because all the things supporting it are there, which I think they're currently missing. So we've got to lay that groundwork. The intention for there to be a very strong stream cross-cutting the entire nature strategy around culturally significant entities and biocultural values and what healthy country means, and particularly engaging Aboriginal communities in identifying those values, assessing those values as to whether or not they're in a healthy state and they need to be restored, and then delivering that work. And so in my area of the department, we have a healthy country team and a cultural science team who are working on some of these questions. And it's obviously not the start of that work. A lot of work our agency has already done in this space. And so trying to bring that together, particularly as it applies to restoration, I think will be some of a new element there. I think there's a really strong there is a really strong history of things like cultural fire and burning. I think in terms of restoration, particularly things like revegetation, there's probably less experience in that sector. So building that up, how do we build capacity of Aboriginal communities to do restoration to complement what the good work's already going on in a lot of these spaces and with things like cultural burning. The next one we called strategic design and delivery. So this is kind of about a broader, it's really bigger than restoration. Like there's a lot of the nature strategy and the plan for nature kind of talk about having a unified framework across all of the different programs and things that our agency does and other agencies and the broader community to meet our ecosystem targets. And so how do we make restoration priorities fit in to that and complement those other things, like in particular, protected area network establishment, biosecurity and pest and weed control programs, land use planning, offsetting. How do we make sure that we're not all doing all these things in isolation and they're all kind of working together towards a common goal? I touched on regulation and legislative barriers around restoration before. That's something we're acutely aware of. We're going through a legislative reform process at the moment with the Biodiversity Conservation Act, which has some relevance to things like licensing around seed collection, for example. That's a sort of key barrier. But there's obviously other pieces of legislation that are relevant here. And so I guess that's a known barrier, and working through that in terms of really just facilitating effective restoration rather than inhibiting it is the goal. Sustainable funding models, I think everyone is aware, obviously, we need resources to scale up restoration, and some of that will need to be public resources, some of that will have to be private. What do those models look like? How do we, as I said before, how does government best invest in the most efficient way to leverage off and complement all the other sources of investment that are going into restoration, particularly things like carbon? How do we leverage carbon projects to get the biodiversity outcomes we want if they're not 100% aligned with the outcomes that we're getting under purely a carbon objective? So that's a challenge that our team has been looking at as well. And then monitoring, adaptive management research. This is something that is always important across, I guess, biodiversity management. But from our perspective, restoration is in such a relatively lower evidence. We're in a position of such a lower evidence base that like we really do need to approach investment in restoration with a mindset of any dollar we spend on restoration, we're evaluating the outcome of that dollar and we're learning about what works and what doesn't, so we can essentially incrementally increase our effectiveness of restoration. And that's another key. Some key projects in our team are doing that now in terms of looking at a network of restoration sites of various ages and understanding what works and what doesn't work. And so finally, I probably touched on all of this, but the way we're kind of envisaging at the moment what this framework will look like is really, first of all, it's going to be relatively high level. It is not going to have all the detail that is required for a proponent to go on and take a restoration. It's really, I guess, a backbone for policies and programs to hang off, but structured around a kind of theory of change, which is essentially we are where we are right now in terms of the current state and distribution of ecosystems in New South Wales. The nature strategy, there should be sort of public exposure of these targets in the next 12 months, will set explicit, probably ambitious targets around what we want ecosystems to look like in the future, whether that's 2030, 2050, 2100. And then we need to get there, right? And so from a restoration perspective, the way I see this framework is basically laying out the steps that need to happen if we want to get there. And that's not necessarily what government's going to do or what government should do. It's really just the fact of this is what needs to happen. And we know that some of that stuff is already happening. Some of it will not be best delivered by government, and some of it will. So I've tried to kind of outline there how I see, I guess, in a bit of a chronological way, how we're sort of working through this. We need to remove those barriers that are evident right now. We need to build the sector capacity, create this kind of enabling environment. We need to build the evidence base, provide that infrastructure. We need to do that strategic planning that, as I talked about before, makes sure everything complements each other and we're not just doing restoration in isolation from all the other sort of NRM and biodiversity management things that government and others do. And then, I'm going to be honest, like show me the money. There's going to be a lot of resources required, right, to achieve this. And so where do they come from? What's the public and private mix? But I guess from our perspective in this framework, where it will really focus on all those steps leading up to that, so that if current or future governments or whoever comes along, where there are resources to deliver restoration, they will be delivered, hopefully, in the most effective way possible because we've done the groundwork so that there's an enabling environment and so that that money is best placed to be deployed in the most effective way. So that's all I got slides for. So I think, yeah, very happy to have some conversation and questions. And I think, cheekily, I'm here talking about this stuff, but I'm really interested in this group, what this group has to say, particularly from a coastal restoration perspective, because I think, my team and the data we have available is, for the reasons that you guys are all aware of, are probably quite biased to the terrestrial realm. So I'm just keen to understand if initial responses to that are, oh, that doesn't work in the kind of systems I work in, or you're missing this, or if you have anything to send through to me later that's like, you should read this because we've done this work, etc. So happy to just leverage the fact that I've got this audience to help us build something that's useful. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, James. That's great. There's lots of clapping hands being raised there, so well done.